Welcome, everybody. Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is
Morning.
Bryce Barrows, and I'm the China Affairs Analyst at the German Marshall Fund of the United States Alliance for Security and Democracy. And I'm also a co-lead of the Truman National Security Project's TruAsia affinity group. And I will be serving as the moderator for this evening. I want to thank you all for joining us tonight for this event sponsored by the Truman Project, and give a big thank you to the History Channel Japan for allowing us to highlight this documentary series, Defending Japan. It's a pleasure to see so many people from different parts of the United States, Japan, and elsewhere to join us to discuss this series. And this is our first event for TruAsia's Indo-Pacific Democracy, Defense, and Media series. So to provide a bit of background on the Truman National Security Project, we are a high trust impact community for national security leaders, and together we develop timely, innovative, and principled solutions to preserve and expand democracy, human rights, prosperity, and security around the world. Our diverse membership includes members on the Hill, like Hill staffers, federal employees, nonprofit leaders, academics, industry leaders, political strategists, and elected officials from across federal, state, and local government, as well as many, many veterans. As co-lead for the TruAsia Affinity Group, my fellow co-leads and I are responsible for building community within the Truman Project's Asia Affinity Group, which consists of Asia specialists or national security specialists with an Asia focus. In addition, we will be hosting future events similar to tonight's that promotes Truman's focus on democratic values and other values in foreign policy with a focus on the region. So to provide a little bit of background, Defending Japan is a documentary series that is one of the top programs on the History Channel Japan. This documentary series has been praised for its factual representation of the security situation in East Asia, and does so by highlighting people-to-people aspects of the US-Japan alliance that normally aren't discussed. This documentary also won Best Documentary at the 2019 Japan Cuts Hollywood Film Festival. So I have the great pleasure and honor to introduce our discussion tonight with Defending Japan's executive producer and US Air Force veteran, Mr. Daniel L. Smith, the former commander of US Forces Japan, retired US Air Force General, Lieutenant General Jerry Martinez, and Dr. Naoko Aoki, a specialist in nuclear security issues in the Indo-Pacific. So a little bit of background on our speakers. Mr. Smith is an award-winning journalist and television producer based in Tokyo. During his 20-year tenure in Japan, he has served as an executive producer for Fox International channels, which includes National Geographic and the Fox Sports International channel. He has also produced programs for NBC Universal Asia, A&E Networks, History Channel Japan, and the Associated Press and Associated Press Television News, with programming featured on Amazon Prime and Hulu. He has earned several awards from his series and through his entertainment company, Oriora Bareilles Entertainment Company, specifically with our documentary tonight, Defending Japan. And in addition, he served in the US Air Force for over 21 years as a public affairs specialist. So Lieutenant General Jerry Martinez has served in the Air Force for 33 years, was the former commander of US Forces Japan, and is now happily a private citizen. And lastly, Dr. Naoki Aoka is a research associate at the Center for International Securities and Studies at the University of Maryland and an adjunct professor at American University. She specializes in political and security issues that concern the Indo-Pacific. And previously, she was the Nuclear Security Fellow and adjunct political scientist at the RAND Corporation. So tonight's format will go as such. We'll start by showing clips from the series, followed by questions for the panelists. And at about roughly 8:40 p.m. Eastern, 5:40 p.m. Pacific, and 9:40 a.m. Tokyo time, we will open this up for a Q&A with the panelists. Just as a disclaimer, the views expressed here are those of ourselves, myself and the panelists, and do not reflect the official policy or positions of the governments of Japan or the United States, Truman National Security Project, the Alliance for Securing Democracy, the German Marshall Fund, or any other employers of tonight's panelists. Now, without further ado, I will begin by showing the first flip from tonight, which focuses on an introduction to defending Japan, as well as Lieutenant General Jerry Martinez when he was serving as the commander of U.S. Forces Japan. Thank you.
The most imminent and serious threat to Japan right now is missile attacks from North Korea. At the heart of any response to a missile or conventional attack on Japan is the Joint Operations Coordination Center at Yokota Air Base. It is located in a sheltered underground area of the base, linked to the Japan Air Self-Defense Forces command post. The facility became operational in 2012 and makes it easier for both military forces to share information and coordinate actions properly. The American general who is tasked with coordinating America's defense of Japan is Lieutenant General Jerry Martinez, commander of U.S. Forces Japan. While missile attacks from North Korea weigh heavily on his mind, and he knows it is of utmost importance in the view of many Japanese people, the general must also prepare his forces for a multitude of military contingencies and adversaries.
Thank you very much. I'm very glad to be here today with the History Channel. I'm excited to talk about something I'm very passionate about, and that is certainly the country of Japan and the many thousands of men and women who serve in the country. There are clearly security concerns in the Pacific region. The area where Japan lives is what I would call a unique neighborhood. You know, we have one neighbor, which is North Korea. North Korea clearly has shown their ability to shoot ballistic missiles, and they've been very highly much in the production and development of nuclear weapons. That's no surprise to anybody. It's very public knowledge, but that is clearly a threat to Japan and a threat to the U.S. forces stationed in Japan. Additionally, you've got what we call long-term competitors, and that's the other two neighbors of Japan, which are Russia and China. They certainly are not our enemies, but they are competitors. We compete with those nations economically, politically, militarily, and we have to manage those long-term competitions with those countries. The mission of our men and women serving in Japan has many different roles. First off, let me start with that there are over 54,000 men and women serving in uniform in the country of Japan. These 54,000 men and women have a very important job. First and foremost, that is the defense of Japan. We, with our Japanese counterparts, our friends, our cohorts, our alliance members, we are here to ensure the security of this great nation. We work hand in hand with our Japanese counterparts to do that, and our men and women are trained to the maximum extent possible to be ready to defend Japan at a moment's notice. But in addition to the defense of Japan, we are the United States' forward forces in the Pacific. So we have these 54,000 men and women way out in the forward part of the Pacific, and their job out here is to ensure security of the region. You know, that region is filled with many different actors, many different characters, and many different threats. And so our forces are out here training every day to manage those threats and any way that those threats may come at the country of Japan. With our forces being here in Japan, it provides a stable, secure platform to enable peace and security in the Pacific region.
The general said mission readiness is at the heart of their training objectives.
Readiness is clearly a top priority of the United States Armed Forces, no matter what country you're in. Our readiness is what gives us credibility. Our readiness is what lets the enemy know that they should never, ever challenge our existence. And so readiness in Japan is clearly a top priority of ours. We work on readiness every day. We work on it through exercises. We work on it through just training at local units. And we work on it through, frankly, study and online and many other avenues, methods that allow us to prepare. And then another facet that we have to work with to manage our readiness is clearly the sensitivities of local populations. The United States, we train at a very high level. We train up here. We never want to train down here because what I can tell you here today is our enemy is never going to come at the United States at this level. They're coming way up here. And for us to train at anything less than up here would be ridiculous. And so we don't. So our training is tough, it's demanding, it's very competitive in nature, and there's risk involved. And so when you put all of those qualities of readiness that we want and training, that doesn't always coincide with what the local population wants.
The general pointed out several joint exercises that play a pivotal role in mission readiness.
Joint training between the Japanese and the United States is absolutely critical. We both have amazing, amazing forces. The Japanese Self-Defense Force is very, very much like our United States military in terms of how they train, in terms of the capabilities that they have, and as well as the very high standards that they keep. But it would do no good in the country if the United States had a highly trained force and the Japanese had a highly trained force, but we didn't work those forces together. So the interoperability between U.S. forces and Japanese forces is critical. It's absolutely critical to the defense of Japan. And so we work every day to test that. We hold numerous exercises on large scales. Those are periodically throughout the years. But in addition to the large exercises, we're interoperable day to day. We have people in my building right here in my headquarters from the government of Japan or the country of Japan almost every day. We have the larger exercises. Those are what I would say on a yearly basis. One example is one we call Keen Edge. We just had exercise Keen Edge here just a few weeks ago. The building that you're sitting in today, my headquarters, was jammed full of people, both Japanese and Americans, and others. We brought people in from all over the world to work on this exercise, and we set a scenario that the scenario involved ensuring the security of Japan from outside threats. And in that scenario, it tested our ability to have interoperable forces. So we do those large-scale exercises, what I would say on a yearly basis. We operate day to day with our Japanese counterparts as part of our training. We have what we call large force employments, where aircraft from the Japanese Air Self-Defense Force and our United States Air Force go up together and practice maneuvers. As we speak, there are ships side by side out there in the waters working together. Our ground forces are conducting operations, they're exchanging training, information. We just concluded an exercise a couple months back called Yamasakura, where our ground forces all got together and I went up there and observed the exercise and the training with the U.S. ambassador. And these things go on every day. There's always some kind of training happening in this country. And that's a message to our adversaries, and that's a message as well to the people of Japan and to the United States of America, that this force, when it works together, is unbeatable. You know, when you understand your capabilities, when you understand your enemy's capabilities, and you train to those capabilities, and you ensure your forces are ready, then that's how you're going to ensure the peace and stability in the Pacific region, as well as ensuring the peace and stability and safety and security of the country of Japan.
It is the stated policy of the United States to conduct rigorous training of the troops, including the missile defense crews, in order to bring some peace of mind to the Japanese public.
Okay, so that was the first opening shot of the show. So for General Martinez, question for you. Can you discuss what it was like filming the intro for Defending Japan?
Yeah, Bryce. First, thank you to the Truman Group for this forum of highlighting this really incredible show that's out there for the world to see now. You know, when I was approached by Dan, you know, I knew coming from Aurora Borealis Entertainment, they were a very credible, you know, entertainment industry leader in Japan. And then when they were coupled with the History Channel, I said, wow, this is really going to be good. And so when they came to me, we talked about it. And you know, my answer immediately was yes. And several reasons why. One is that this show is highlighting the alliance, which is very important to me as the commander in Japan. You know, we want the people of Japan and we want the strategic threats around Japan to know that our two countries work together and that our alliance is clad strong and that, you know, you cannot mess with this alliance without detrimental effects to you. You know, it allowed us to show the partnership that takes place every day, the training, the exercises, and all of those things. And it gave us an opportunity to brag on our men and women. We're real proud of what our men and women in uniform do. And I guarantee you the Japanese Self-Defense Force is just as proud of their men and women, what they are doing. But probably the for me, the most crucial thing that this show did, and starting right away with the introduction, as you bring up, is it allowed us to give a really straightforward assessment of the security around Japan. And the people of Japan need to know that. And our enemies need to know that. And maybe not an enemy, but certainly a competitor needs to know that. This forum did that. And so, I was really excited doing this introduction. It was fun to sit with them in my office for several hours. And I knew without doubt, when they walked out that door, that you were about to see one incredibly great series. I just knew it. And history has proven I was right on this one.
That's amazing. And you've answered this a little bit already, but can you discuss why, from a military perspective, you think shows like this are necessary?
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't mind a very short lesson, there's a document that we have in the United States of America. It's called our National Security Strategy. And this document is put out by the White House. And basically what it does is it guides all the organizations throughout the government to be in line with what our executive office deems are the threats and things that we need to worry about for the United States of America. And the reason that I bring that up is I can give you this document in about 4 or 5 seconds. And really it's 4 countries that concern the United States on a great level. And then there's extremism and terrorism as well. And the countries are China, Russia, Iran, and Korea. And this is a public document. It's not classified, and it's out there for the world to read. And I love to start all discussions I have when I talk about the security of Japan with this document, because a lot of people haven't put this together, that the United States, the most powerful military and country in the world, when you look at the entire globe, there's 4 countries that concern us: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. 3 of those 4 nations are Japan's immediate neighbors. And that is really telling. So that's what it's, you can look at this another way. Imagine if we woke up today and instead of Mexico, that was Iran, and instead of Canada, it was China, and instead of Cuba, it was Russia. That would change the way that we live in this country. And so it's really important to understand those threats. And when you walk around Tokyo, Tokyo is a booming city. It's a fantastic city. There's nightlife, there's food, there's karaoke if you want to sing that, and even a shot or two of sake, if you want to taste some good Japanese alcohol. And it's very easy to be in this wonderful, beautiful city and to not really understand that there is a dark cloud around Japan that we must deal with, and we must recognize, and we must understand. And that's what this show does. This show shows the partnership, the cooperation, the friendship, the training, and most important, it shows that when you put the U.S. forces with that Japanese self-defense forces together, it is incredible, and it's a lethal force that will defend that country.
Thank you for those answers. Moving on to Mr. Smith, can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to produce this show, and were you inspired by your time doing public affairs in the U.S. Air Force?
Well, first off, I want to thank you guys again for putting this on. We really appreciate it, and I'd like to thank the viewers who's actually watching. I'm getting texts as we speak right now, but yeah, it was as you alluded to earlier. I spent most of my military career as a public relations guy. Basically, that's what we are, and I'll be honest with you. Most of the time, we're dealing with problems. These commanders deal with a series of problems on both the military and the civic area. And so that's where we come in. We come in and we sort of assess the situation. We try to explain to media that despite this particular problem, look at all the good we do. And I got to the point that I never saw the good that we do on film. So I had made a promise to myself. I knew I was going into the entertainment business because that was my interest before I actually got into the military. And once I got into a position where I could actually create programs, this was one of the first programs on my list. I actually went to the Fox network, which I was working for at the time with the program, and I thought they would do it, but for whatever reason, we didn't get around to do it. And thankfully, John Flanagan, who's the president of A&E Japan, Network Japan, and also the History Channel there, he actually came back to me and said, "Hey, didn't you have an idea for a military program? Because we think that might do well on our channel. So that was the emphasis, but it was mostly because of all the problems I saw associated with us, being a military member, being assigned to different countries and not seeing what all the good that we did, only seeing that when there was problems, when there was crimes and things like that. So I just wanted to give it more of an even keel.
That's awesome. So to move on to the next clip, we are going to provide an overview of Japan's overall national security situation.
There is no welcome mat in the unfriendly skies Japanese and United States fighter and reconnaissance pilots navigate. Its occupants are well known. There is Russia, which has increased its presence in both Northeast and Southeast Asia, where Russian Bear bombers and reconnaissance aircraft routinely fly missions in the Sea of Japan and Pacific Ocean around Japan. Russian bombers and patrol planes also enter Japan's northern airspace close to Hokkaido and to 4 smaller islands claimed by both countries. China has also been a violator, forcing the Japan Air Self-Defense Force to double the number of fighter jets used to intercept military aircraft threatening Japanese airspace. Japan recorded more than 561 such events in the first half of 2018 alone that required scrambles of its fighter aircraft. The number of incursions are at historic levels and continue at a pace of 3 times every day.
There's almost not a day that goes by that we don't hear our Japanese friends taking off to intercept aircraft that are infringing on the air defense identification zone without contact. When anything like that does happen, our job is to stay out of the way. We let our Japanese friends do their job.
Since 2013, Chinese H-6 bombers have increased near approaches to Japanese airspace, making flights between Japan's Okinawa and Miyako Islands from the East China Sea and encircling Japan from the south and east.
China is sending military aircraft through the airspace that is claimed by Japan as another example of showing that China controls this territory, even though it does not. And so each time the Chinese planes transit this territory, the Japanese will scramble fighter aircraft to meet them and escort them out of the airspace. The concern is that when the Japanese have a response, there could be an accident, there could be a provocation that is unexpected, and that this could lead to a real crisis.
So, Dr. Aoki, based off the situation described by General Martinez and the clip that we just saw, what would you say, how do you think Japanese society's perception of security threats in the region is like?
Hi. Well, thank you for having me on this panel. Thank you to the Truman National Security Project on a very important topic and a fascinating documentary series. I'm sorry, my internet connection was very bad when you asked the question, and I'm just going to assume it was about Japanese security, Japanese threat perception. Yes, okay, all right, thank you. So in terms of Japan's threat perception, of course, the first thing that comes to mind is North Korea, which is what Japan calls a grave and imminent threat, because North Korea has dozens, it's estimated to have dozens of nuclear weapons. It can launch ballistic missiles of varying ranges. And Japan assumes that North Korea has the capability to hit Japan with a nuclear armed missile if it wants to. if it chooses to. In terms of China, there were airspace matters that were covered in the video clip. I will also highlight that Japan is concerned about China's assertiveness in the East China Sea near the disputed islets, which Japan calls the Senkakus and the China calls the Diaoyus. The Chinese Coast Guard has increased its activity in that area. And in 2020, for example, a total of over 1,100 Chinese Coast Guard vessels were observed by Japan over 333 days of the year. And that's more than double what it used to be, what it was in 2012. So these are some of the issues that concern Japan. And very quickly on Russia as well. Japan is also concerned about Russia's collaboration with China, which includes two long joint flights that took the two countries' planes from the sea of Japan to East China Sea to the Pacific Ocean. So those are some of the most visible worrisome incidents that Japan sees today.
Thank you for answering that. And I think that paints a really good overall perception within Japan, the Japanese populace. General Martinez, can you discuss a bit about, during your time as commander of U.S. Forces Japan, which countries you thought posed the biggest threats?
Yeah, without question. When I took command in 2016 and left in 2019, the most immediate threat to me every day at that time was North Korea, without exception. You know, I came in to command in a very unique time when Kim Jong-un was really rattling his saber. I mean, he really, really was. And I can put this into perspective for you. You know, we're sitting here talking the way we are now. And, you know, I'm at home in a very calm environment. My phone rings. And I used to have a few items in my house as the commander. So my home lights up, the red phone, the green phone, everything's going crazy. And, you know, you pick up the phone and they say, General Martinez, North Korea just launched 4 ballistic missiles. They're headed towards Japan. And that's my call, right out of the cold. And something like out of a movie, we're running to our command post. People are scrambling all directions. I'm on my phones and other things giving orders. And it was a chaotic time. And I'll tell you, you look at Kim Jong-un, and one of the ways that I love to show how aggressive he was simply doing a comparison with his father and with his grandfather. You know, Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il, before Kim Jong-un, they did launch missiles themselves. And the interesting thing is that they launched 31 missiles combined over a 27-year period. Okay, so 27 years, they launched 31 missiles. Kim Jong-un launched 89 missiles since coming into office. And if you want to even understand a little more, in 2016 and 2017, in each of those years, he launched alone in that year, almost just a little short, but almost the same amount of missiles that his father and grandfather launched in 27 years in just 1 year. I mean, he was laying them out there. And then the thing that was scary was not just that he was launching these missiles, but it was the rhetoric that was going with it. I will sink Japan. I will nuke Japan. I will destroy Washington, D.C. I will sink Guam. I will blow Hawaii to smithereens. And he was going on and on and on with this rhetoric. And then the part that really made it scary, you know, these ballistic missile launches, was that mating those launches with potential abilities to use nuclear weapons. You know, if he could get a weapon and develop the nuclear program, made it to an intercontinental ballistic missile, you know, then he could hit the United States, the CONUS. But even with, you know, medium range missiles, he could hit Japan with a nuclear weapon. And he did a test 1 year with a hydrogen bomb. And to put it into perspective, he made a real statement when he exploded that bomb. You know, the horrific devastation from World War II that occurred of dropping the bombs, you know, was really, really bad. And you've seen pictures and you can understand how horrible a nuclear weapon can be. Those bombs had, you know, roughly, you know, 15 kilotons, somewhere around there, that you know, as powerful as they were. The bomb that he exploded, the hydrogen bomb, was 7 times as powerful as those bombs that we exploded in World War II. And so that clearly put that threat in front of us, that he's developing missiles and he's developing nuclear technology. And if he can ever put the two together, we're in really bad shape.
Thank you for that answer. And to highlight this a bit more, our next clip is going to be about North Korea's nuclear missile launches.
April 21st, 2018. The news out of North Korea that they will shut down a nuclear test site and freeze further nuclear and missile tests is being greeted by both hope and skepticism by South Korean, US, and Japanese officials. Is this the news that will ease fears in Japan of more missile tests? It is a sudden strategic move that belies the recent history of North Korea, which just 8 months earlier did this. On the morning of September 15, 2017, many residents in Japan woke up to the sound of emergency sirens blaring and government officials on loudspeakers giving them the most dire of warnings. The North Koreans had launched a ballistic missile, its second launch in 2 months, and it was flying directly over Japan. Japanese television stations immediately interrupted their normal programs with the announcement. Several bullet train lines were temporarily halted, and many fretted whether it was even safe to go to work. The missile flew over Japan's northern island of Hokkaido, forcing government officials to take the extraordinary measure of warning residents in its path to take cover. This was the second North Korean missile to fly over Japan within a month, and it came less than 2 weeks after a North Korean hydrogen bomb detonated at its Punggye nuclear test site. The missile launch did more than just give many in this nation of more than 127 million people the jitters. It was a move, a fiery propaganda salvo that ventured much farther into the Japanese psyche than the 1,700 miles the North Korean missile traveled before it splashed into the Pacific Ocean just east of Japan. Even though the threat posed by North Korean missile launches are very critical, it still does not seem real enough for people living in Japan. The population understands the fact that missiles flew over Japan, but because it's not visible to their own eyes, people take it for granted they are safe and secure. And despite the latest news of a freeze on North Korean missile tests, the fact that this can change at any moment is a frightening reality. What can Japan and U.S. forces do to combat the threat nuclear and other ballistic missiles pose to Japan? Can Japan be kept safe from the unthinkable?
Okay, so General Martinez, can you talk a little bit about, during those missile launches, what was the partnership like between you as the commander of U.S. Forces Japan and your Ministry of Defense and Japanese Self-Defense Force counterparts?
Yeah, that's a great question, Bryce. In times of crisis, the best thing you can have is true partnership. That's when reality comes in, when things go bad, of whether, it was a lot of verbiage and a lot of talking, or whether you truly have a strong alliance. And during these missile launches, our alliance and the strength of it showed incredibly. The cooperation between us and both the government of Japan as well as the Japan Self-Defense Force was unbelievable. The communication was incredibly well. We got to a point where we were really sharing intelligence with each other. We were starting to, get very good at predicting, when he was going to launch those missiles and where they were going to go. And that kind of cooperation, was truly needed. I'm really proud to say that when he launched those missiles, many of them, not just the 2 that went over Japan, is that in the Air Defense Command, which is the Japanese command center that manages, the fighter scrambles around Japan, as well as the ballistic missile defense and the Patriot battery missiles that will shoot those missiles down as they come into Japan. This Air Defense Command, as these missiles were being launched, we had U.S. service members standing right next to their Japanese counterparts. This wasn't over the phone. This wasn't sending emails. They were standing right next to them, and we were getting a real-time sharing of information. They were getting real-time direction from their boss. My men and women were getting real-time direction from me, and the cooperation could not have been better.
That's really good to hear. And I think, Dr. Aoki, can you give a little bit of a overview of what, the serious threat from North Korea's missile program is for the US, Japan, and the broader region like?
Of course. So the video clip mentioned correctly that North Korea said that it was going to stop testing long-range missiles. And that was in 2018. And they have not conducted long-range missile tests, so the intercontinental ballistic missiles that can reach the continental United States, and they have not conducted nuclear tests since 2017. But they have resumed short-range ballistic missile tests in 2019, and they've conducted almost 30 of them over the last 2.5 years. And when you look at the kinds of ballistic missiles that they are testing, it shows that they're trying to complicate the ballistic missile system. So they're the kinds of missiles that can fly at a lower trajectory. They're the kinds that can change flight paths, which complicate ballistic missile defense. And North Korea has a capability to continue making material for nuclear weapons. So given all that, the North Korean threat is not just continuing, but increasing for US allies and US troops in the region.
Thank you so much for that. And to kind of provide more of a human face to this, Mr. Smith, we want to know, what was it like filming the show at such a heightened time for US and for national security for the United States and Japan?
Well, I would tell you, we always left open when we worked with the History Channel and AE, that we would cover what was topical at the time. Defending Japan is a pretty difficult show to do because, as you can see, it's an hour format, lots of filming and things like that. And I believe the missile went off on when we got a missile threat, and we literally had to turn the episode around in about 10 days. So we had to do a lot of scrambling. We have a good team. I had to give out credit to our production team, especially our editors, Mike Olson and Richard Colombo, Ellen Walton, and some of these other guys who do a lot of the editing program. But we're constantly looking to find material and do interviews. And one of the things which we haven't talked about, but to do a show like this, you have to get approval from the Pentagon, first off. And we did so through their LA office. And in fact, I think one of the listeners, Lieutenant Commander Walton, is actually listening to the program. But one of the reasons we did that, because it gives us quicker access, as Jerry can tell you. We didn't have to, every time something happened, we didn't have to wait and go through a coordination process that took 3 or 4 days. We literally could call them and we can be out there that same day filming stuff. So that was a big help. Getting that agreement probably made it a lot easier for us to be very current with what was going on in North Korea. And at that time, as Jerry said, I think that was the emphasis of our first 3 programs, because there was so much going on there.
That makes sense. And since we're coming about to 8:40, I'm going to show one more clip, and then we'll open up to question and answer. And our last clip that we will show, if we don't have any interest to keep asking questions, we can show some more clips, will be about natural disasters and Japan and how that factors in to the US-Japan alliance.
Japan sits at the center of one of the most strategically important locations on the planet. This position is also one of the most unfriendly neighborhoods in the world, with Japan facing major security threats from China, Russia, and North Korea. North Korean nuclear missiles capable of reaching Japan. Incursions in Japanese territorial waters and airspace by Chinese and Russian naval forces and military aircraft. all represent a clear and present danger to Japan's safety. But these security challenges, which are critical, pale in comparison to the most dangerous threat facing Japan: natural disasters. Tsunamis, earthquakes, typhoons, floods, landslides, and volcano eruptions. Natural disasters threaten more Japanese in 1 year than North Korean missiles, Russian bombers, and Chinese naval forces combined.
So, Dr. Aoki, can you talk a little bit about, the threats that natural disasters pose to Japan, and how does that play off in the wider U.S.-Japan alliance?
Sure. Yes, I think the video does a good job of explaining how, well, the security threats, like the ones that Japan faces from North Korea or China or Russia, are obviously, if they take place, it's a major, major event. But normally the probability is pretty low, thanks to activities by the US and Japanese troops that deter those actions. But natural disasters are a different matter. And Japan is a very disaster-prone country. It's earthquakes, for example. Japan accounts for 20% of the world's earthquakes of magnitude 6 or over. And it also has 7% of active volcanoes, even though its land area is 0.25%, I believe, of the world. So it has these sort of characteristics that make it vulnerable to natural disasters. And given climate change, of course, natural disasters have become larger and more severe. So this is a threat that Japan has to deal with, and it does threaten people's lives. And disaster relief is the self-defense forces one of the pillars of its activities. And this is an area where US and Japanese armed forces also cooperate, as we saw in 2011 in the earthquake and tsunami in Fukushima.
Thank you for that answer. And it's also worth noting that disasters are a common theme across Japanese history, especially in art, wood carvings, etc. And some of those beautiful forms of art in Japan feature sort of fears over natural disasters over the last several millennia. So moving to the question and answer, I've got a question for you, Mr. Smith, first. So just to highlight your job as the showrunner and the executive producer, why do you think the show has resonated so well with viewers?
I think it's a number of reasons. One is that we try to simplify it. One of the things that Jerry actually taught us when we first interviewed him, most of my staff, I'm the only one of my staff actually who's ever served in the military, who has any type of military experience. So, for them, they learn as we go. And when we went into the office and we interviewed Jerry, a lot of my staff members came up to me afterwards and said, wow, I didn't know this. I had no idea that this was going on. So we try to keep it simple. And I know John Flanagan and the guys at History Channel agree with us on that. Second, I think that I don't, being a producer, I never try to lose fact that even though it's a documentary, it still should be entertaining. And I think we go out our way to make it entertaining, as factual as it is. I mean, some of the visuals that we use are pretty astonishing. I mean, we have a research team, and that's all they do is go through video and pull out comparative videos. So when we're talking about something, we can show it, but we can really elaborate on it. We had a series on the USS Ronald Reagan, which Richard Clemmo, when our guys shot at some of the footage, it was actually astounding to get that. So we look at that, and then we also, I've never been one of these editors who's very thick-skinned. I love getting feedback. And so my friends will tell you, many people watch this program now, I will send clips as we are editing programs, which is a no-no for a lot of producers, but I send them out all the time and ask people, what do you think? Do you think this resonates? Do you understand this? You know, is it easy to get? So I do a lot of that, which is a little bit different from a lot of producers, but it's just something, my style. I like to make this as active as possible with the people that we are producing the program for.
That's amazing. And I've got one follow-up question before we go in. And actually, one of our attendees asked this question as well, Darren Wilson. Due to the overwhelming success of the series, will there be a second season? And how do you think a second season, placed in 2011 and 2022, 2021 to 2022, how do you think that would be different from the first season? Like, what would it cover that's different?
Well, for starters, yeah, we would all love to do a second season. I know that's on the plan. When you have these type of projects, it's not just the idea that you want to do a show. You have to get funding for it. We were fortunate in the first year that A&E and History Channel funded the entire series. Now, in the second series going forward, we probably need sponsorship to do that. But we definitely want to do it, and on both sides of it, from the History Channel, from our perspective, and even guys like Jerry, because we've approached him actually to talk about a second season with him now being retired and maybe being a contributor to that second season. The thing that's most, I would say, how we would structure the show to be a little bit different from the first season is that we had to deal with the surface threats, stuff that you saw, but we couldn't really get too much in depth because the show, even though it's a 1-hour program, I mean, it takes a lot to explain things in that manner. So what we would do differently, if we would widen the scope of areas of topics that we would do. I mean, there's stuff happening in space now that we do. And so we take input from a lot of military commanders who said, hey, guys, this was a great episode, but have you thought about doing this? Or have you thought about doing that? And in that instance, I think we have plenty. We could do 6 or 7 seasons without ever hitting the same topic twice.
That's amazing. And I think, again, with some of the questions that we have, Mark Walton, first of all, wants to thank you for the shout out that you gave.
Yeah, I got to tell you a quick story about him if we got time. Okay, so, and he might not agree with this, but Jerry, we all have different interpretations of it, but it was right up to the deadline for us to actually start filming the show based on the History Channel's anticipated on-air time. And we were really behind the power curve, and we were coordinating with Mark, who did an excellent job of getting back to us and say, hey, we got to do this, we got to do that. But it came down to, we literally went to Jerry's office without the authorization, the final authorization approved. And we were sitting out in the lobby because we're trying to coordinate with Mark and we're trying to coordinate with Jerry's guys. And we're sitting there. I'm a public affairs guy, so I know the rules. So I can't blame anybody. I know what the rules are, that we can't do it without permission. And so I think I sent Mark, or either I emailed him, and I said, hey, look, we are about to interview General Martinez. What do we tell him? Do we tell him that we can't do the interview? And he says, well, where are you? He said, well, we're literally outside his office. And I think Mark, he said, let me get back with you. And he got back with me, real quick. He says, why don't you go ahead and do that? Why don't you go ahead and do that? And so that was big. I mean, we were on pins and needles with that. And I don't know what Jerry got from his perspective. I don't know if he knew about that, but.
And, Mark also asked, is there anything you wish you could cover in the series that you didn't cover?
Yeah, there's stories that we filmed that haven't made the air yet. I mean, we have material right now to do 3 or 4 more episodes just on things that we have filmed. But it's like I said, we learned with each episode. One of the things that we did was a little bit different this series. Unfortunately, we don't have a clip to show it, but we also did segments on military people. We had a story where a Japanese military person married an American military person. And it was weird because she had a higher clearance and she couldn't talk to him about his job. And so it was just that kind of situations. And we also had other stories about individual pilot at Masao Air Base, I believe, and she had followed in her father's footsteps. She became one of the first female pilots there, but she flew in the same squadron that her father flew in. So we always try to add those kind of personal stories in addition to the strategic stories.
And for everybody here, I've gotten the chance to see the documentary. I think the story that Dan just highlighted is actually really one of the more fascinating ones and one of the more human, stories from the U.S.-Japan alliance. He's referring to a couple, a Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force petty officer who marries a U.S. Navy petty officer. They both work for intelligence for both the Japanese military and the U.S. military, respectively. Have a loving marriage, have a kid, everything. Due to the work that they do in their respective countries' intelligence communities, they can't talk about their jobs, which I think for many of the people in this audience who work in international affairs, work in security cooperation, the intelligence community in some cases, worked abroad, lived abroad, maybe have a wife that's not a U.S. citizen or became a U.S. citizen after meeting abroad. I think that's a very familiar story. And that's what I love about the show is you highlight those stories. Obviously here we're talking about the national security implications and whatnot, but to the U.S.-Japan alliance, there's so many other things that have come out of it, including marriages, kids, really strong bonds between the U.S. and Japan, which your show highlights. And I would love to see more of that because I think that's one of the more fascinating aspects of it. The next question comes from Mr. Matthew Koch, and I think I'm going to just pose this to everybody here, whoever wants to take a swing at it. What do you think would be required to establish better diplomatic relations with the DPRK? Not a hard question.
I'll tell you what, why don't we give Naoko the first shot?
I'm with you. Let's go with Naoko.
And I'll throw in my 2 cents when she's done.
Okay, so thank you for the question. Yes, it is a very difficult question. North Korea has not really responded to U.S. overtures for dialogue since the Biden administration came into office. And it may take a while. And at the moment, North Korea is very much closed off to the outside world, mainly because of COVID. So there are other elements at play here. But diplomacy has to happen. I think diplomacy has to happen at some point in order to manage and preferably solve the situation. Of course, it's important to keep deterring North Korea, but if we are to try to cap North Korea's nuclear and missile abilities and roll them back, we do need some kind of diplomacy at some point in the future.
Yeah, I'll tell you, from my perspective, you look at this problem and Kim Jong-un got what he wanted. He wanted a seat at the big boy table. That's really what he did. He made a lot of noise, upset a lot of people. And in the end, he had meetings with President Trump. He had meetings with Vladimir Putin. He had meetings with Xi Jinping, and all of a sudden he was on the grand national stage. And, he has credibility that he has to keep with his people. So there's a real balance here on how do you get at that country? Because one, I think deep down, Kim Jong-un knows he's got to have cooperation outside of his country, but internally, he also has to look strong for his people and preserve his regime. And so in my mind, I think one of the ways that we can, try to move forward with them is possibly using South Korea a little bit more in the discussions. On the peninsula themselves, North and South, although they've clearly, not always been friends, but the one thing they do is they understand each other, and they come from, a similar background. And so I think, in my mind, trying to get South Korea a little involved with some discussions. I think also pressuring China, who has a lot of influence over North Korea, maybe using their influence with South Korea. And then, of course, our own, should Kim Jong-un decide he wants to talk with us, that it's going to take a combination of things like that. I don't think there's an easy one road path to getting him to cooperate.
Thank you for those answers. Oh, or Dan, you have comments?
No, I'm good.
Okay, so to move on to the next question, Ms. Sonia Shelton asks, how do all of you feel COVID-19 has impacted the alliance working together? I know, Dan, you have some unique insights into this, so feel free to add the first swing at this question.
Well, we in fact, our current episode, which is coming out, I think August the 28th, deals with the battle of COVID-19. And we spent literally a year working on this episode from the beginning until, here's a pandemic that basically ended the governments of two of the most powerful countries in the world, Trump administration and Abe administration in Japan. And it's one of those things where the military has to take a back seat until they're called in. That's the role of the military, even though guys like me with military experience would have said, hey, call these guys right away. They can handle this type of situation. But, that's not the way governments work, especially democracies work. So we tried to show that. We went a little off script in terms of we didn't lean as heavily on the military because, our series, when we talk about defending Japan, goes into all aspects of defending Japan, not just the military, but also stuff that is done on the State Department level and things like that. So I think we found some interesting things. And there's a segment in there, which is, you speak of near and dear to me, about the Chisholm Games, which is a series of games that was held in Wuhan, China, which, some people say it could have led to the spread of super spread stuff. But we explore all that. And I think what we've always done with our shows, we always try to give a very balanced, open, ended look at stuff so that so the viewers can make up their own mind. But Jerry could probably talk to you about the specifics of, what the bases do in terms of that.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. This COVID crisis, it hit the world, and we had a real balance in the military of how do you handle this? Because one, you have to preserve your force to fight if you need them. So having everybody infected with COVID clearly wasn't going to work. So, the bases implemented rules just like businesses did all around the world, governments implemented rules. The bases were the same way, that, hey, we've got to preserve our force. But the difference with the military and with, say, businesses that, said, hey, let's work from home and, let's manage it this way. You can't do that completely with the armed forces. You can't practice shooting AMRAAM missiles from home. It just doesn't work. There's a certain degree of training that has to continue, a certain degree of education that has to continue. And so military commanders, not just in Japan, but all over the world, had to balance that. And, they did a really good job. They put a lot of rules in place that protected the people on the base. But what they didn't do is stop operating. Military men and women are trained to operate in all environments, to include very harsh chemical environments. I've worn that chemical suit out in very hot weather, and I've done those exercises in that suit, and you practice drinking water through that mask. And so, our forces can operate when they need to do. But this was tricky. This was a challenge, and it was a very unique time, not only in our history in the military, but the world's history.
Jerry, I have a question for Jerry. Do you think the military was brought in soon enough in Japan and in the US? Because I know that they called aspects of the military.
Yeah, I think it varied a lot by location, Dan. And, there were areas where the military was brought in and then it was determined they weren't even needed. And then there was areas where they were brought in to provide logistics, transportation, and other things like that. And it proved crucial to getting first responders and equipment and supplies to places it needed to go. And so, there's always a hesitancy, to bring in the military first, because you have a lot of agencies in all of our governments in the United States, Health and Human Services, et cetera, that are really responsible for managing a lot of these crises. But in most cases, in the end, if it's bad enough and big enough, the military is definitely going to be brought in.
Thank you for those answers. And to move on to the next question, so Mr. Hansen Mock asks, and I think Dr. Aoki, I think you're most qualified to probably give a first swing, but I really want to hear what you have to say, General Martinez, as well. So since the Japanese Diet revalidated the interpretation of the Constitution in 2015 that gave the Japanese Self-Defense Force more power to defend allies, do you see Japan as a potential exporter of security to augment U.S. and ally forces in the region? And I'm going to throw in another hot topic of Japanese national security at the moment. There's been a lot of discussion about Taiwan, specifically how does it relate to the Japanese Self-Defense Force. A lot of signaling from Japanese officials in the last few months about working with the United States and in some cases Taiwan's own military forces about maybe repelling any sort of like Chinese armed conflict.
Great, thank you. Thank you for those questions. In terms of collective self-defense, yes, that was, as you mentioned, an event or a development that took place. But self-defense forces in Japan have faced constitutional, legal, political, and fiscal restraints that that other militaries in other countries do not face. So I don't think this will lead immediately to other activities that that you may see in the United States, for example. In terms of Taiwan, yes, this has become a very timely topic, and Prime Minister Suga's meeting. This was a topic in Prime Minister Suga's meeting with President Biden, and there have been comments by political leaders and military officials. So I think this debate is ongoing. I don't get the sense that the Japanese public is fully behind it yet, and but I think this debate is definitely ongoing, and it's certainly going to continue.
Yeah, you have to put yourself in the shoes of the Japanese, and I look at the United States, and since World War II, you can talk about Korea, Vietnam, Grenada, Desert Shield, Desert Storm, Desert Calm, Desert Strike, the Balkans, and we can just go on and on and on and on with the amount of conflicts that our nation has been in. And I'm not saying that we like war, because we don't, and I'm not saying that we want war, because we don't. But what I'm saying is that world events have put us in places where we have experience being in combat, many, many times since World War II. And then you look at the Japanese citizen, and they haven't fired a shot in Japan in 70 some odd years. And so you have generations that have grown up now that don't even know what combat is. They've never seen it, they've never heard it, and they definitely don't understand it. And so when you have a society like that, and then you have a constitution that is pacifist in nature, it makes it very, very difficult, to turn that switch and go, hey, let's get offensive. The 2015 peace legislation that you're referring to, there are some that think that, that opened up the floodgates. Well, it didn't. The legislation were baby steps that allowed, in certain cases that maybe we can start reinterpreting the Constitution in some conditions and in some cases. But what it didn't do is give carte blanche to go out there and just do what you want. And then while I was the commander, a piece was passed called, it's the 95-2 Mutual Asset Protection. And this agreement, what it did is it now allowed Japanese self-defense forces to defend its allies in certain cases with certain conditions. And I won't go through what the conditions are because we don't need those to be public, but there are a set of conditions that are predetermined during certain activities that, should these conditions occur, the Japanese forces can defend, say, a US aircraft. And that was a huge, huge step for the country of Japan. Huge, huge. And, in the United States, we go, oh, that was another treaty or something. But to a country that hasn't fired a shot in 70 plus years, that's a big undertaking to say that they would be willing to do that.
Thank you for those answers. And like I mentioned, it's a very timely topic. As a China analyst, this pops up very often in my professional life. So the next question I have is from Michael Banach, which is sort of similar. And he asks, how does increased engagement between China and South Korea and the Philippines impact, U.S. overall Pacific Alliance, infrastructure ability to defend Japan, and in some cases, the ROC, and I'm assuming by the ROC he means Taiwan.
Who would you like to take that question?
Dr. Aoki, if you feel comfortable. If not, Jared, I would love to hear what you have to think about that too.
Of course, I'll just add a little bit about China-South Korea relations, and how that plays into the trilateral security cooperation among Japan, South Korea, and the United States. So US and Japan have a very strong military alliance. US and South Korea have a strong military alliance, but the connection between Japan and South Korea do not have a very strong security alliance, security cooperation, because of their history-related problems. That goes back to the 35 years of Japanese colonization of the Korean Peninsula. So, and the fact that so it's important for the three countries. I think it's important for the three countries to maintain close security cooperation, particularly in the era of competition with China, and that does put South Korea in a fairly difficult position. But maintaining those ties and hopefully improving the Japan-South Korea, the third part of that trilateral link would be good, I think. But even if that doesn't happen in the short-term future, I think maintaining those two very strong alliances would be important.
Yeah, I think, when you look at China, without question, they're the 10,000-pound gorilla in the room, right? I mean, when you look at the Pacific region and the influence that they have all over, they are the long-term strategic threat that we all need to worry about. And so, managing China, you've got to first look at their past behavior if you doubt the threat that they are. Literally in just the last 10 years, they've been incredibly aggressive in their actions with their ships, with their airplanes. Their military spending has gone through the roof. They built islands in the South China Sea that weren't even islands. They're man-made. And then they took those islands and they put highly sophisticated military equipment, on the islands. They started the One Belt, One Road initiative, which at face value looks like a really nice effort, to help many countries around the world. But in all truth, it helps China the most and gains them influence. And then they got really heavy into what we call debt trap diplomacy. And that's where you lend people money that they can't pay back. And so one example was Sri Lanka, where they lent them $1.4 billion to build a really super fancy port. And then knowing that Sri Lanka couldn't pay it back, then they went and said, hey, if you'll sign a 99-year lease to us for the port, we'll let things go as is. And so what they did is they just maneuvered themselves into literally having sovereign ground in Sri Lanka. And then, of course, you cannot ignore the displayed arrogance that China has shown, to include just a few days ago, putting out a propaganda film that said, Japan, if you were to ever help in a Taiwan scenario, we will nuke you and nuke you and nuke you until you have complete and unconditional surrender. And I mean, the arrogance of a nation that holds nuclear weapons to speak like that is unheard of. You look at the nations around the world that hold nuclear weapons, and none of them talk like that. That arrogance about using their nukes so freely just is not done. And so, we have to manage China. And the way that you're going to manage China is through relationships, it's through partnerships, it's through treaties with each other and multiple countries. And so even though you look at South Korea and Japan, and they clearly have their differences, based on history, in time of crisis, those two nations are going to have to come together, bar none. They're going to have to. And the interlocutor in all of that is going to be the United States of America, because you have Japan, who is a staunch ally, and you have South Korea, who is a staunch ally of the United States. And being that we're partnered with both of them in times of real serious crisis, it's going to really be on us to do our best to bring those two countries together to get cooperation.
Thank you for those answers.
We've seen evidence of that just in filming the show, because there's been a couple of episodes where the story actually bled into South Korea because of the interaction between the U.S., South Korea, and Japan. So it's something that they're already doing, and they work really hard to do.
Thank you for those answers. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to get to all the questions, and my apologies for everyone who's asked. We have about 9 more left. We might only be able to get to a couple. So the next one is an anonymous question, and I think this is really timely. I was reading Tobias Harris's book, The Iconoclast, about Shinzo Abe's political career and some of the inner workings of the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan, especially more of the right-wing part, which is much more hawkish. And this question relates to that in that it asks, how have provocative military actions from China and North Korea influenced the Japanese public's sentiment towards national military buildup? Jerry, I would love to hear what you have to say based off your time as commander, followed by Dan or Naoko.
Yeah, I think one of the deceiving things when you hear about, previously Prime Minister Abe and, back then Cabinet Secretary Suga, and now Prime Minister Suga, when you hear about their political party, it's the Liberal Democratic Party. Now, I will tell you, they're not that liberal. They're a party that deeply cares about the security in Japan. And the evolution of what has occurred within the Japanese self-defense forces, this 2015 peace legislation that we just talked about, the 95-2 mutual asset protection that we talked about, all of those things were done under the Abe administration. He has clearly taken the government and pushed in an aggressive way that Japan has to be ready to defend itself. Now, they won't use the O word, i.e. offensive. They don't use that word. But what they've clearly done is they've positioned Japan to be in a much better place. And you can look at like one of their carriers, as we would call them in the United States, and they don't call them aircraft carriers because an aircraft carrier is an offensive weapon. That's the weapon that started World War II, if you remember, by launching all those aircraft off of an aircraft carrier. But what they do is as they gain the F-35 aircraft into their inventory, they've taken a ship that looks a lot like an aircraft carrier and they call it a multi-purpose ship. They've given it a name that now allows it to be used in a fashion that isn't necessarily offensive, but clearly moves it in a whole different track than being just purely defensive every day. And so I have real confidence in the Japanese government that they understand the threats around them, that they're taking the right actions. They're buying many, many F-35s. They're buying Global Hawk, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft. And I could go on and on and on with the number of things that they're purchasing. And what that symbolizes is the significance that they take in understanding the security of their country, and not that they just have to talk about it, but that the government of Japan has to take action. And in my mind, they're taking very bold steps forward.
I'll let another questioner get in because Jerry had a good answer there. So.
Okay, and this is going to be our last question. And thank you everybody for joining. And when we're done, I'll give some special shout outs. So the next question I have is for you, Dan. Well, actually, we kind of asked that question already. Sorry. So this is kind of a catch-all for everyone else. Moving forward, what are the biggest threats to the U.S.-Japan alliance? And, how does that play out? And everything from a Taiwan scenario to sometimes even a North Korea scenario. Or China, just in general.
I would say China. Most of the research and stuff that we've seen shows, in terms of the military power, in terms of the economic clout, in terms of they have no inhibitions about intimidating their neighbors. They do it every day, as Jerry said. And although North Korea probably gets more attention, I would say China, without a doubt.
Yeah, for me, when I was the commander, the way we used to phrase this is that our immediate threat and Japan's immediate threat is North Korea. But our long-term competitor and the long-term thing we need to worry about is China. And, I mentioned all those things that they do. And, you can sum China up really by asking, what is it that they want? What does China want with all these things that they're doing? And it's really kind of simple. They want political, economic, and military influence globally. Now, granted, those are real easy statements to make, and there's a ton of tentacles under each of those topics, but they want influence in those three categories, and some will also say intellectual property. And our strategy has to be, how do you go at those three areas? How do you stop them from getting economic influence and military influence and political influence? And we don't have time today, but I can go through, if anyone's ever interested in the steps that we're taking in all three of those categories. But I do have to say, if you'll allow me real quickly as we wrap this up, I really want to thank, Aurora Borealis Entertainment, and the History Channel for putting this series together. This has done a tremendous amount, not just in entertainment, but this has really done a lot for the alliance. The Japanese citizens are watching this. The people in the government of Japan are watching this. U.S. forces are watching this. And this show really highlights the importance of why we need to all work together. And, it's entertaining. It really is. It's incredibly helpful and informative. But the one thing that I really like about it is something that nobody does as well as the History Channel in the world, and that is to make shows education. When you walk away from here, every single person to 100% that I've ever met that has watched this show, and then they come talk to me, they say, I didn't know that. I didn't know this. I didn't know that. And I'm talking some really educated people, that are highly trained, that they'll watch us and go, wow, I had no idea. So I thank the History Channel for educating all these people. And I truly thank Aurora Borealis Entertainment for working with the History Channel and putting together a product that goes well beyond entertainment and is a product that is truly helping the U.S.-Japan alliance.
And I'd like to give a couple of quick shout outs too, because you saw those amazing graphics. Those were done by a guy named Aika Chen in our organization with Riho Sakai. And then we have some of the other staff, but our staff really works hard to put out a great show. And we really work closely with A&E and the History Channel to make sure we're putting the best show out there. I think from the start, we had very high standards for this program. And I don't think we've ever dipped below those standards.
So on that note, I want to thank everybody for joining our event. I want to thank John Flanagan at History Channel Japan for allowing us to use the footage, as well as History Channel logo for this event. I want to thank Mr. Douglas Montgomery for allowing us to put all the people together so we could put this event on. I want to thank my co-leads for TruAsia. I'm not sure if I should name them, maybe because they might not want to be named publicly. And also all the other staffers at Truman, Rachel Rizzo, Pooja. This has been a really awesome event. And thank you, General Martinez, Dr. Aoki, Mr. Smith. Thank you for coming together for this event. This has been awesome. Last question.
My honor.
When do you think the show will be available again in the United States on Amazon Prime?
Well, I wish you could call in John Flanagan, because he's the guy who can answer that. But I know they're working very hard to do that, because part of the thing Jerry can tell you, I mean, we are deluged with fans from all over the world, not just the United States and Japan, but from all over the world, who says, hey, when are we going to get the show? So as a producer, it's something that makes me feel proud of, that my guys put together this program. And I got to, again, credit to like my co-partner, Gutney Gutnison and Mika Kyle and all these guys who work on this program. But yeah, we'd like to see it on more. We'd like to see it on more platforms, which we are working on. We're working on with distributors who's going to distribute it into other countries. But let's hope that we can put it together and get season 2, because I think that this has been a good project. I love working on it, and I'm going to love to interview your other guest here, because we definitely need her on the program. I'm sitting there and Jerry's telling me about stuff I'm learning so much from her. I was like, wow, this is great. So in the back of my mind, I'm already writing scripts now for the season 2. So domo arigato.
So on that note, thank you everybody for joining. We really appreciate it. And Naoko, please go ahead.
Yeah, come on, give her time.
No, thank you for being, it was an honor to be on this panel. And the footages were amazing, and I really look forward to the second season.
All right. Thank you, everybody. And everyone here in the United States, whether it's on the East Coast, Pacific Coast, or elsewhere, have a good evening. In Japan, everyone have a good day, good morning, rest of your morning. And thank you so much for tuning in. Take care.
And
Goodbye.
Bryce, a huge thanks to you personally and the Truman Group.
Yes,
You did a
yes.
fantastic job.
Great job. Great job.
Like I said, thank you to the Truman team for allowing this event to happen, because at first glance it sounds crazy, but it works very well.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care. Good night. Bye.